So for your boot gift bag, all sizes, and I'm doing the medium one here, but all sizes require the same pattern pieces cut. So you're going to need 2 body exterior pieces. I'm using a red velvet here. I think it's going to be a pain in the bum because it's constantly fluffing, but never mind. 2 exteriors and 2 interfacing, and I've already applied the interfacing there. You're going to need 2 exterior and 2 interfacing gusset pieces, and I've already applied the interfacing on that. You're going to need a flap. You're going to have to cut a exterior piece, a lining piece, 2 interfacing, and a fleece, which I have already centered and fused onto the exterior flat piece. You're going to need body lining, 2 of, with 2 interfacing, and I've already fused that there. And you're going to need a lining gusset, 2 lining and 2 interfacing, which I've already fused. And you'll need a base support made cut from Decaville. This is Decaville 1 Heavy. That's the thicker version out of the 2, so you'll need to cut one of those. So apart from your fabrics and your fleece for your flap, you're also going to need some foam. This is Biani Soft and Stable Foam, which is like Velcro and all the rubbish sticks to it. But yeah, you'll need some foam. You could use fleece too, but it won't stand up in the same way that the foam ones will do. I like to use a sew-in foam because I find that the fusible foam wrinkles terribly and I don't like the look. The interfacing that I've used is a woven interfacing. There's many different varieties now, but SF101 is a brand that you'll probably see or be very familiar with. Mine is called Easy Fuse. Now, hardware, you don't need much of it. I'm using a rivet snap, magnetic snap. You can use a regular one if you prefer. I like the rivet one because I can just add it at the end really quickly and easily. If you're using a standard magnetic snap, you will have to install that during construction. Otherwise, the rivet snap just goes in at the end. You will need some handles. You can use ribbon or webbing or whatever you have on hand. For this one, I'm going to use these here, which I've found for 50 cents at a clearance at my local fabric store. So I'm just going to cut that off there, and I'm going to use those as my handle. And for the front, I think I will add this white ribbon in a bow onto the front of the bag. So it doesn't really matter exactly what width you have. I've just been using whatever width I have on hand. And I've mostly made most of my test samples with ribbon only. And I think that's handy for a gift bag, and it's very inexpensive as well. Retrieve your gusset pieces, your exterior gusset pieces. I've already fused my interfacing. If you haven't, you need to do that now. And what we will do is place that right sides together. If you're using a directional fabric, you need to make sure that that's going to be the bottom of the bag, so your fabric needs to be running in the right direction, being that the top of your bag. So make sure you have that around the right way. I'm just going to use a couple of clips, clip those together, and we're going to go over to the sewing machine and stitch that seam, and then press that seam open. Okay, so now I'm going to stitch my bottom gusset seam, and I'm going to use my normal seam allowance of 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimetre, and my stitch length is 2.5. I'm just going to go over to the ironing board and press my seam open. Okay, so now that I have pressed my seam open, we're going to retrieve the foam and we're going to pin this in place, wrong side down onto the foam. I like to place my pins in the direction that I will be sewing. Once you have pinned all the way around your gusset, retrieve your two exterior body pieces. And we're going to pin those in place as well. Like that. Now we're going to go over to the sewing machine and we're just going to baste all the way around these pieces, and I'm going to be using a 1/8 of an inch seam. I'm going to baste all the way around. Like that. So retrieving your Decaville 1 base support, we're now going to put that onto our gusset exterior. Now what you need to do is just write back at the top of, or the back piece if you have a different front to back. And we're going to measure down. For the small, you would go 19 centimetres or 7.5 inches. For the medium, which is this size here, I'm going to go 28 centimetres or 11 inches. I'm just going to draw a line across here. I'm just using an ordinary biro because this is in the back and nobody's going to see it. If you were doing the large size, you would be measuring down 35 centimetres or 13 3/4 of an inch from the top of your back. And then we're going to centre this between the two seams and we're going to fuse that in place. And once you've fused that into place, just leave it cool for about half an hour. That will allow the glue of the Decaville to set. That's the shiny side that goes down. If you move it too soon, it doesn't stick real well and it'll come away, but once you leave it cool and set for half an hour, it pretty much never comes off. So retrieve one of your boot pieces, one of your body pieces, and your gusset, and we're going to put the back at the back here, like so, right sides together, and we're just going to clip this bit to hold. I'm going to clip all the way down this straight piece here, just with clips, up till we start to go round the curve. Just back from that a bit and bring this other side round to make it meet at the front of the boot body, and we'll just clip that there. Down here a couple of pieces until we start to get to the curves. And now I find that clipping, it tends to slip, so I like to staple this. Staple it within the seam allowance, approximately 1/4 inch, 6mm from the edge. Just make sure your pieces are lining up. And work your way around this curve. So now at this point it's going to look as though our gusset is way too short for our boot body, but that's because this outer edge here is longer than the actual seam line, and that's the part that we've got to be concerned with, because we need the seam lines to match. So what we need to do is position our decaville so that it's along the straight edge of the body. So I'm just going to clip it for now while I double check that I've got the right amount of gusset on either side of that curve. Now it's going to obviously look way too small. So that looks pretty close, so that tells me I need to shift this over just a little bit. Because when I start clipping into my gusset, it needs to just bend around nicely there. It's going to be a little bit harder on the point of the toes because it's a really big curve there. Now I'm just going to start snipping into my gusset around this curve. I'm going to snip approximately 6mm, 1/4 inch into my seam, about 1 centimetre apart. Now when that spreads apart, that makes it much easier to get to fit. Just by squishing, squish. Grab my stapler. And now we'll just head over to this side and do the same thing. Like that. So once you have all that clipped into place and stapled, or you can baste with a needle and thread, now we're going to go over to the sewing machine and stitch all the way around that curve from your top, from the gusset side. We're going to stitch seam allowance of 1 centimetre, 3/8 inch. Using a stitch length of 2.6. Sometimes you might need to lengthen that even more when it's on foam if it's not stitching very well. squish your foam out of the way. Like that. So now we need to remove our staples. Like that. Now just turn out and inspect your seam. Make sure it's all looking good. You're happy with that. And that will be good once I get rid of all that extra foam. And see, I was being impatient because I wanted to get on with this video and I did not allow that to cool properly before I started using it. And so that's what happens. Okay, so now that you're happy with your seam, you've checked it and everything's looking good, you've removed your staples. Now we need to do some trimming. We're just going to trim off this basting stitch on both sides. Now once you've done that, retrieve your pinking shears. This is what I like to use. And just trim around those curves. Try not to clip your stitches. Like that. Now we're going to go back over to the sewing machine and we're going to stitch that seam again, just in case we have snipped the seam somewhere. So I'm just stitching my seam again, and where I've got a bit of foam sticking out there, I'm going to try and stitch next to my seam on top of that foam to flatten it. Your second body piece. Now we're going to put this right sides together. Make sure we've got the back and the back of the body. And yes, that velvet is making a mess. So we're going to follow the same procedure of clipping the straight bits and stapling around the curves. I'll have to be careful there that I don't hit that with my needle. But there we have it. And we need to go over to the sewing machine and stitch around our seam. Okay, stitching from the gusset side. Seam width of 3.8 or 1 centimetre. 3/8 of an inch. Not 3.8. 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimetre seam allowance. Okay, here we are again. We need to remove our basting stitches and staples and trim our foam back. Probably a good idea to do the staples first. Like that. Now we're going to go back over to the sewing machine and we're going to re-stitch this seam just to make sure that we haven't clipped into it anywhere. That's this one here. Okay, so now I'm going to stitch my second row of stitching right next to the first row. So retrieve whatever ribbon or webbing that you are using for your handles. I'm going to snip this hardware off because I don't want it. And I need to cut for the medium 20 inches. If you're making a small, you just cut 13 inches. And for the large, 22 inches. That is small 33 centimeters. Medium 50 centimeters and large 56 centimeters. So I'm just going to do inches right here because this is what my cutting mat is. I'm not going to get a second one out of that, so I'll just grab the other one that I have here and snip that off. And 20 inches. I'm just going to grab this lighter and singe the ends. You can use fray stopper, but you need to do something to stop the ends from fraying out. There, now retrieve your bag. We're just going to turn that right side out. Now we're going to grab our strap and we're going to position this for the medium. It's going to be 1.5 centimeters from the seam. Which is 1/2 inch. Leave it extending over the top edge of your bag by about 1 centimeter, 3/8 of an inch. Doesn't really matter exactly what you put there, so long you do the same on both sides. And then make sure your strap is around the right way. And position that one on that side 1/2 inch or 1.5 centimeters from that seam. Pin in place. And we'll do the same on the other side. Like that. I'm going to baste my handles in place. Just run a row of stitching, approximately 1/8 of an inch, anywhere in the seam line, seam allowance. Doesn't have to be exact. Just so long it's basted on. Like that. Now we'll just set that aside for the moment. So retrieving your flat pieces, we need to place these right sides together. Now if you've got directional fabric or something with a nap that runs in a certain direction, you need to make sure you've got it going the right way and leaving this top edge open, because that will go at the back of the boot and that goes at the front, so bear that in mind if something has a direction. Now you can clip or pin or just take it over and match it up at the sewing machine, but I like to put some pins in here just simply so I know or remember not to stitch that, and I just stitch those 3 sides. So we'll head over to the sewing machine and stitch. So because this velvet is a shocker and it tends to shift a lot, I'm just going to put an extra couple of pins in. You probably wouldn't need to do this if you're not using velvet. Just something about it, it tends to walk. So I'm going to make sure it doesn't. Ask me how I know, because I've already stitched this once and it walked all over the place and made a mess, so I had to undo it. So here we go. This time it's pinned securely so it can't go anywhere. And I'm using a stitch length of 2.6 and a seam allowance of 1 centimeter, 3/8 of an inch. Leaving the top end open. It's already walking a bit there. Really should have chose quilting cottons for this video, it would have been easier. So there we go, we have that stitched. Okay, so now we have our flap sewn. We just need to trim back our seam at the corners. like that. I'm just going to turn that right side out, but before we do, I'm just going to give that a bit of a finger press. You could also take it over to the ironing board and give that a press, just to help get a nice seam when you turn it so it sits properly. This is my old stuffing stick from my bear making days, teddy bear making days. Comes in handy for pushing out seams and corners. Like that. So now what we need to do is just go over to the ironing board and give that a good press. And then we're going to stitch all the way around using a 3mm 1/8 of an inch seam, or you could do 6mm 1/4 of an inch seam if you prefer. Now that I have pressed my flap, I'm going to stitch all the way around using a 3mm 1/8 of an inch seam. I'm going to use this foot to help me get it nice and neat. I'm going to increase my stitch length to 3.3. Like that. Retrieve your boot. Now we're going to put this exterior side down onto the back of the boot, and we're going to center it between the seams, line the raw edges, align the raw edges, and clip or pin. Actually, because this tends to shift the velvet's a shocker, I'm just going to stick a pin in there as well. So now I'm going to go back over to the sewing machine and I'm going to base that on using a 6mm 1/4 of an inch seam. Just putting my regular foot back on. I'm just going to take this back off. It's easier with a flatbed. Put this up here. And I'm going to base that on using a approximately 6mm 1/4 of an inch seam. Like that. Retrieving your body lining and your lining gusset, we need to do more or less the same thing we have done before, and for a start we need to join our gusset pieces together. If you're using a directional fabric, you might want to watch the direction of your fabric because it goes up and around like that. So it's got to be running the right direction. So now we'll go over to the sewing machine and stitch that seam. So I'm just changing my thread colour to a colour that better suits my lining. A 1cm 3/8 of an inch seam, put my stitch length back down to 2.5. need to go and press this seam open like that over at the ironing board. Okay, so retrieving your body lining pieces and your gusset, we need to pin this to the boot, gusset to the body. I use pins for this because I find clips don't hold it good enough. So we're pretty much repeating the same steps we did for the exterior. Like that. So now all we need to do is go over to the sewing machine and stitch around that seam. Okay, so now I'm going to stitch this seam using a 1 centimetre 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Back here, it's a little bit wonky donkey there, so I'm just going to go back and fix it. Like that. As I said before, I'm not too worried if this isn't perfect, if there's a little tuck somewhere or whatever. I'm not going to be worried at all, but that looks pretty good anyway. So now that we have stitched that seam, we need to pull out these staples. Forgot what they were called there for a minute. Like that. And with right sides together, we need to do some pinning. Always have my straight gusset on the uppermost when it's really curvy bits like this, because it's a lot easier than doing it that way. Actually, I've forgotten, we need to leave this back piece open. So just grabbing a marker and I don't know where my fading marker is at the moment, so I'm just going to mark within the seam allowance. I'm going to mark about 4 centimetres down, which is 1.5 inches, and that's where I'm going to start and stop stitching. So I'm just going to put 2 pins in there, that'll remind me. Leave that open. I'm just going to go down to where it starts to curve. That's where I'm going to start stitching again. So I'm leaving all that piece open for turning. All we need to do is go over to the sewing machine. We're going to stitch all the way around to there and down to there, and we're going to leave this open. So leave that piece open. Okay, so here we go. Now we're stitching using a 1 centimetre 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, stitch length of 2.5. This is the back of the bag where I'm leaving it open, because it's much easier to close it once it's turned through the back of the bag than if you tried to close that front curve. Two pins in there just to remind me that that's where I'm stopping and starting. Okay, so now we're doing some staple removing. That. Now I need to do some clipping and notching. I'm using my pinking shears down this curve. Don't snip past into the opening area, because you want to be able to easily close that, and if you've snipped it, it'll be harder. Like that. So now we're just going to go back over to the sewing machine and re-stitch this seam, just in case we've snipped into the seam allowance there somewhere, but I don't think so, but still I like to make sure, so I'm going to stitch again. Just restitching my seam for security. I'm going to do the top bit even though I haven't slipped anywhere there, but I like to make sure it's nice and secure. Stitching right next to the previous seam line. like that. Now we need to turn our bag wrong side out. We're going to stuff the flap and the handles down inside the bag like that. Our lining then needs to be right side out. Like this. Now we're going to put that down into the bag. Make sure your toe is going into the toe. And you're matching up the correct seams at the corners. Okay, so now what we'll do is we'll go around and exactly match each of the 4 seam lines. And I'm going to use a pin to hold this because it holds it more securely. Just want those seams to be sitting exactly together. Now we just need to stretch and ease all the way around to make that fit. You can use pins or clips. I'm going to probably use a combination of both. Like that. Now I'm going to go over to the sewing machine and stitch all the way around that bag. Now I'm starting at approximately in the middle of the back, stitching a 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimetre seam allowance all the way around. The stitch length is 2.5. So now what we're going to do is try and remove as much of the foam as we can. And I'm just going to remove the flap basting stitches so that I can get a bit more of that. Now I'm not going to trim anything away where the strap is because I'm going to do some more stitches on either strap piece there just to really give that some strength. But I will snip away this bit of foam in between. Like that. Now, through the hole that you left in your lining, just going to pull this bag, turn it right sides out, and a bit of fluff in there. No, it doesn't matter, but gosh, it makes a mess. Now we need to close this hole. So just fold and finger press. Use your fingernail to get that seam allowance under. Just eyeball it. Try and align those edges as close together as possible, because you want to stitch as close to the edge as you can. You could also do this by hand with a slip stitch if you want to make it more invisible, or with a ladder stitch. A ladder stitch is the most invisible. That's what I used to use when I used to sew up my teddy bears. Okay, so now we're going to go over to the sewing machine and stitch close to the edge. My chair is so noisy. Okay, so I'm stitching as close to the edge as I can, hopefully not going over the edge. Trying to keep the edges as aligned as possible. Finished, just inspect both sides to make sure that you haven't ran off and left a hole somewhere. And if you're happy with that, we're good to go. So now we need to push our lining back down into our bag. And we need to roll these with our fingers so that the seam sits exactly at the top. And we're just going to grab some pins. Really shove that lining down with your fingers inside the bag there. And we're just going to put some pins in. To make sure that that lining's nice and taut there. If anything, roll it a bit towards the back or the inside rather than the front, because you don't want to have bits of lining showing at the front of the bag. On the exterior of the bag. Grab a hammer, and I can't do it here because I'll shake my camera too much. But go over to a firm surface. I've actually got a cement floor here, so I have an old cladding mat on the floor, and I'm just going to put it down there onto the mat, and then I'm just going to bang each one of those corners just to wallop those. Give them a really good wallop just to flatten that, so it makes it so much easier to do the final top stitching. And I also just hammer along there as well. So I shall do that now. There. Whew, that was a workout. Now I've given that a really good wallop in each of those seam points, and believe it or not, that will make stitching a whole lot easier. So that's what we will do now. We'll go and stitch all the way around top of our bag using a 6mm 1/4 inch seam. I'm going to start at the back of the bag. I'm going to change my foot. This foot makes getting a nice 6mm 1/4 inch seam easy. So it has a little guide there. If you don't have a free arm and you have a flat bed, then you would be stitching from the lining side with the bag going up round like that. And I'm going to up my stitch length to 3.3. Make sure your straps are out of the road. You don't want to be stitching them down inside your bag. Yeah, like that. Now we need to install our magnet into the body at the front here. We need to put the female piece, that's this piece, the piece with the indentation, and in this case it's fatter, so that needs to go there. Now for a small, it is 2.5 centimeters, 1 inch down from this top edge. For the medium, which is this one, it's 5 centimeters, 2 inches down, and for the large, it's 7 centimeters, 2 3/4 of an inch down. You can use your pattern piece to mark the spot, or you can just measure it like I'm going to. So I'll find the center. So for the flap, we need to measure that up 2 centimeters. For the medium, I'll just find the center here. And the small is 1.6 centimeters, 5/8 of an inch. Medium is 2 centimeters, 3/4 of an inch. And the large is the same, 2 centimeters, 3/4 of an inch. Like that. So now I need to put a hole punch into here. Actually, what I like to do is put a couple of pins in here just to hold the lining in the right spot. Smooth it down with your fingers underneath. That'll just stop it from shifting when you're punching a hole. Like that, especially since you've got to manipulate the bag so that you can get at the hole, and just make sure you're only punching through this one piece and not the back of the bag as well. Now we need to swap this over. So we need that piece. And just remember to make sure that you're putting that piece onto the right side of the bag. So I need to put that way. So that is punched there like that, and that is in there. Take the pins out. Now for the flap. Now if you want to add a ribbon when you're doing these, it's so much easier. Now this is not going to be long enough, I don't think. Oh, I suppose it could be. Yeah, I might make it matching. Why not? So I'll so that now we need the other gadget. And then I can tie a little bow. Little being the operative word. Spin it around. Some people have a real knack for tying bows. Can't say that I do. If you find it keeps coming undone, put a little bit of glue on there. Snap it into place, and that is your bag. But I recommend giving it all a good press before you fill it with your goodies. Needs a good press.